At what point do so many coincidences pile up that, just calling it coincidence doesn't really cut it anymore? We're going to break down an argument that tries to draw a pretty sharp line between chance, patterns, and absolute certainty.
So this is the question that sits right at the heart of the whole argument. It's really a thought experiment, and it's designed to push the limits of our own intuition. I mean, we all have that mental tipping point, right? Where we stop just accepting things as random and start looking for a reason. So where is that line for you? The author uses a really simple analogy to help us kind of find it.
Okay, so imagine you flip a coin. It lands on heads. No big deal, right? Our minds have no problem just accepting this as pure chance. It's 50-50. A single, simple event with no deeper meaning whatsoever.
But now, imagine you toss that same coin 100 times, and it lands on heads every single time. The first toss was chance. The 10th toss, that might feel a little suspicious. But by the 100th time, the author argues your rational mind just rebels. The word coincidence suddenly feels absurd, almost like an intellectually lazy answer. Your brain immediately starts hunting for a hidden order, a weighted coin, a magnet under the table, anything other than just random chance.
So that intuitive leap that we all make, that jump from accepting randomness to demanding an explanation, that's what the author takes and formalizes into a logical principle. It's not just a gut feeling, it's presented as a kind of law of reasoning.
And the author calls this the law of receding coincidence. Now, accordant events is just a fancy way of saying events that line up, like the coin always landing on heads. So as these matching events pile up in a clear pattern, the probability that it's all just pure chance gets smaller and smaller until it basically vanishes. And at that point, the author claims, our minds have to replace chance with a new explanation, a design, an intent, some kind of underlying law.
So this lays out the logical journey, right? Step 1, a single event, is just noise. It's chance. Step 2, a repeating pattern starts to grab our attention. It makes us suspicious. And finally, step 3, a massive interlocking system, well, that just demands a much better explanation than plain old luck. Now let's see how the author applies this exact principle to their main argument.
And here's where we pivot. We move from this abstract principle to the author's primary case study. The text applies this very same law of receding coincidences to the Qur'an, arguing that it presents a pattern that's way more complex than 100 coin flips.
This quote introduces a really key concept, the cosmic mosaic. The argument's focus isn't on finding one or two verses that seem scientifically ahead of their time. Instead, the claim is all about their deep interconnectedness, that thousands of points of knowledge all fit together, like tiles in this huge, coherent picture, where every single piece actually illuminates the others. So, what does this mosaic actually contain? Well, the author points to all these layers of knowledge across completely different fields. You've got verses on embryology right next to deep insights into the human soul, principles of law woven to stories about history. The argument is that all of these diverse threads, science, psychology, law, literature, they're all bound together by one single overarching theme, monotheism.
And it's this combination of complexity and time that really forms the core of the claim. The author's point is that for one person to produce such a massive, internally consistent body of work across dozens of different fields with no contradictions over a period of 23 years, well, that just stretches the idea of human genius or sheer luck way past its breaking point.
Okay, but you might be thinking, what about a singular, once-in-a-millennium genius? The author totally anticipates this question and sets up a direct comparison. To really test the uniqueness of this phenomenon, the text places the Qur'an side by side with what are considered the greatest achievements of the human intellect.
And here, the author draws a really stark contrast. The argument goes something like this. Even the works of Plato or Shakespeare are clearly products of their time. They contain the scientific errors or the cultural blind spots of their age. By contrast, the text claims the Qur'an is different, that it speaks with a universal voice, totally free of those historical or personal limitations, presenting a fully cohesive system, not just what it calls islands of brilliance. This quote really gets to the heart of that comparison. The author is suggesting that in any human masterpiece, it doesn't matter how brilliant it is. You can always find the flaws. You can see the seams in the cloth. You know, that moment where the writer's knowledge fell short, or their logic faltered, or their own ego colored the work. The central claim here is that those kinds of seams are just absent from the Qur'an's fabric.
So let's just quickly recap the journey of this argument. We started with the simple probability of a coin toss. We established a principle about how patterns challenge our idea of chance, and then we applied that principle to this complex text, even comparing it against the peaks of human genius. So now we arrive at the author's final conclusion.
And this brings us full circle. Remember how 100 heads in a row felt like a logical impossibility for pure chance? Well, the author now makes it pretty dramatic leap of scale. The question becomes, if 100 simple repeating events force us to look for a cause, what about thousands of complex, interwoven truths all pointing in one single direction, all within a single text? And this is the argument's final destination. It's structured to lead the reader on a logical path, where, at the very end, the sheer weight of all this accumulated evidence is meant to go beyond a simple calculation of odds. The author posits that this whole journey from probability is designed to bring you right to the shores of faith.
And so we end right where we began, but on a much, much bigger scale. The entire argument we've just walked through really hinges on this one question. Whether we're talking about 100 coin flips or thousands of interconnected ideas in a sacred text, the challenge being posed is for you to define that threshold for yourself. It's a fascinating look at the limits of logic and the nature of evidence, and it really leaves us to ponder that very line.
All right, today we're diving into a book that makes a pretty bold claim. It suggests that deep within the verses of the Quran, there's a description of the heavens that lines up with modern science in some really uncanny ways. So the big question the book poses is this: are these just a bunch of lucky poetic metaphors, or could they be evidence of something more? Let's unpack the author's argument.
You know, the author starts by painting this really powerful picture. For as long as we've been human, we've looked up. The sky was everything to us. It was our first storybook for myths, our first clock, our first map. It was this vast, mysterious realm of gods and monsters. And it's something we all still do, right? We just look up at the night sky and wonder what it all means.
So how does the book say the Quran dealt with this ancient, universal fascination? Well, it frames the text perspective as something totally new, not just another myth, but a complete shift in how we were supposed to think about the cosmos.
And here's where the book draws a really sharp line in the sand. On one side, you have all the ancient myths. They imagine the sky as a solid dome, maybe a place where angry gods threw lightning bolts, basically a reflection of our own human fears. But the author argues the Quran proposed something radical. It said the heavens aren't a monster to be afraid of, but a sign to be studied, like a gallery filled with clues, inviting us on a journey of discovery.
Okay, this is where the author's case really starts to build. And the first major piece of evidence isn't about the sky's purpose, but about its actual physical structure, its architecture. The whole argument here really hinges on this one single Arabic word, tibaqan. Now, the book makes it super clear that this word doesn't just mean heavens in general. Its specific meaning is in layers, or stacked one on top of the other. And that's a huge deal, because the common belief for centuries was that the sky was just one single solid thing. The book presents this word as a complete departure from that ancient idea. And this is where it gets really interesting. Fast forward hundreds of years, and what does science discover? Our atmosphere isn't one solid thing at all. It's a series of perfectly distinct, stacked layers. You've got the troposphere down here, where all our weather happens. Above that, the stratosphere, holding the ozone layer, our planet's sunscreen. And higher up, the mesosphere acts like a cosmic shield, burning up most meteors. The author's central claim is that this one ancient word, tibaqan, is an incredibly precise description of this very structure, long before we had any tools to see it.
So, a single word that seems to align with a complex scientific reality. The author just puts the question out there. Is this simply a coincidence? But this is just the first piece of the puzzle.
All right, so if the sky has a layered structure, the next logical question is, why? What's the point of those layers? This is where the book shifts from architecture to function, focusing on this idea of the sky as our guardian.
The next key phrase to know is saqfan mahfuzan. The book really leans into the power of this metaphor. Think about it. A roof isn't just an object. It means shelter, safety, home. The author argues this one word transforms the cold, empty void of space into a secure covering for us. But it's that second word, mahfuzan, protected, that really carries the weight.
Protected from what, you ask? Well, according to the author, this isn't just poetry. It's a job description. This protected roof shields us from cosmic bombardment by burning up meteors. It deflects lethal solar winds and radiation. It's also a thermal blanket, trapping just the right amount of heat so we can survive. And it keeps our planet's water from just escaping into space. The book's point is that this single phrase is argued to contain 4 distinct, vital scientific functions.
So now we've got a specific structure and a multifaceted function that seem to align. The question of coincidence gets a little louder now, as the author starts to build this cumulative case.
The third point the author brings up is this really elegant idea of duality. It suggests that the very same thing in our sky is responsible for both its incredible beauty and its powerful defense. It's both an artist and a warrior.
The focus is on this verse that says the nearest heaven is decorated with lamps, but that these same things are also used as missiles. Now, the obvious reading is that stars are the lamps and shooting stars are the missiles, right? But the book proposes a much more interconnected and frankly fascinating interpretation.
According to the book's interpretation, what if the lamps aren't the stars, but the countless tiny particles in our atmosphere? These are the exact particles that scatter sunlight, painting our sky blue and giving us those breathtaking sunsets. Okay, that's the beauty. So what about the missiles? Well, the author argues that these exact same particles create the intense friction that incinerates meteors, turning them into what we see as shooting stars. It's one system, with 2 jobs, creating beauty and providing protection.
Okay, let's just pause and take stock. A layered structure, a protected roof with multiple functions, and now dual-purpose atmospheric particles. With every new piece, the author argues that the odds of all this being a mere coincidence get smaller and smaller.
And this brings us to the final section, where the author basically takes all these different threads and weaves them together, arguing that they aren't just isolated facts, but parts of one single coherent system.
The final key term is araj. This word describes the sky as having the quality of return. This isn't static, it's dynamic, it's cyclical. It suggests the sky is constantly in the business of sending things back. And once again, the book connects this one word to a whole host of scientific ideas. What does the sky return? It returns water to the earth as rain. It returns heat back to the surface, keeping our planet livable. Its ionosphere returns radio waves, which makes global communication possible. And, as we've already seen, it returns meteors by burning them up. The author argues this one word perfectly captures the dynamic, interactive nature of our atmosphere.
And here it is, the author's crucial point. This isn't just a list of random, lucky descriptions. It's all deeply interconnected. The layered structure is what allows for the protected roof. That roof works by returning things, deflecting threats, and recycling resources. And the very particles in that structure are both the lamps and the missiles. It's presented as one single, unified, coherent system.
So let's just quickly recap the book's entire argument. It starts with the structure, heavens in layers. That layered structure enables its main function, a protected roof. This protection works through a dual-purpose mechanism of lamps and missiles, and the whole system is dynamic, defined by its quality of return. The final argument is that these pieces lock together perfectly to form a cohesive picture that the author claims was simply impossible for anyone to have known in the 7th century.
This quote from the book really brings it all home. The author's position is pretty clear. One of these points might be a coincidence, maybe even 2. But when you have this many detailed descriptions, all interconnected, all pointing to the same scientifically coherent picture, well, at some point, calling it chance starts to feel like a real stretch.
And that really is the ultimate question the book leaves us with. It's not demanding blind faith. It's simply asking us to look at the evidence it's presented. At what point does a pattern become so strong, so consistent, and so interwoven that it crosses the line from just a bunch of coincidences to something more? That's the question the author leaves for you to decide.
Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating argument from a book called 1001 Coincidences. We're going to focus on Chapter 3, which looks at the incredible significance of one simple thing, water, as it's described in the Qur'an. The whole time, the author keeps asking this one central question. Are all these remarkable statements just a coincidence?
You're going to see this phrase pop up again and again because after each piece of evidence, the author sort of ironically throws it out there, pushing the reader to really think. So we're going to walk through that exact case, looking at what a 1,400-year-old text has to say about biology, ecology, and even oceanography, all through the lens of water. All right, let's get into it.
So, the very first piece of evidence the author presents goes right to the heart of our existence, the origin of life itself.
Now, what's so wild about this is the context. The author points out that this verse was revealed in the middle of the Arabian desert, a place where your entire life revolved around finding a well. And right there, in that specific environment, it makes this massive universal claim about biology.
And this is where the author draws a direct line to modern science. Biology today confirms that the basis of all known life, this stuff called cytoplasm, is mostly water. In fact, our own bodies are over 70% water. We're basically walking oceans. Every single vital process inside of us depends on it.
The author really zeroes in on the specific language here. The term ja'alana, we made, isn't passive. It implies a deliberate divine act of creation. At the time, this was completely revolutionary. You had Greek philosophers debating whether everything was made of 4 different elements. But this verse singles out only water as the origin point for every living thing.
So this is where the author throws down a challenge. You see, the verse doesn't just state a scientific fact and leave it at that. It connects it directly to belief. The argument is, if you accept the biological reality, the conclusion that all life comes from water, how can you just ignore the verse's premise about where that reality came from?
Okay, so building on that foundation of life's origin, the author's argument expands. It moves from where life comes from to the incredible system that sustains it, the water cycle.
The author really dissects this verse, showing how it paints this incredibly detailed picture. It's not just rain falling randomly. The book argues this verse presents the water cycle as a continuous, deliberate act of divine grace. And again, it's all in the details. In measured amounts, that points to this perfect ecological balance, right? Too much rain, you get floods. Too little, you get drought. The phrase, gave it lodging, is seen as this beautiful description of groundwater, stored beneath the earth like a hidden treasure. And then that last part, able to take it away, that's a powerful reminder that this entire system is a gift, not something we're entitled to. The argument then shifts to another crucial piece of this system, the winds. And the author highlights one specific, really potent Arabic word that's used to describe their role.
And that word is lawaqeh, which translates to fertilizing or pollinating. The author calls this a scientific and rhetorical masterstroke, and you can see why. It perfectly captures the dual role of the winds. They don't just carry water vapor, they also pollinate the clouds with tiny particles of dust and sand, which are essential for raindrops to actually form. A concept that wasn't scientifically understood for centuries.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The author shows how the Qur'an takes this natural cycle and elevates it into tangible, observable proof for one of the biggest mysteries in all of theology, the resurrection.
This verse couldn't be more direct. It draws a straight line between the revival of a dead, barren landscape by rain and the resurrection of human beings from the dead. It's a powerful one-to-one analogy. According to the author, this isn't just some nice poetry. It's presented as a form of logic. The argument is this. The same power that can bring a dead patch of earth roaring back to life is the very same power that can bring a body back to life. It takes this huge, abstract idea of the resurrection and grounds it in something we can see with our own eyes. And that leads to this really powerful rhetorical question that the author frames. You see this lesser resurrection every single year, every time it rains and the world turns green. So why, the argument goes, would you find it so hard to believe in the greater resurrection? Every little sprout becomes a sign. From there, The author takes us on a deeper dive, literally, exploring a really specific phenomenon, one that's completely hidden from the naked eye. What happens when freshwater and saltwater meet?
So here, the verse talks about two distinct seas, and it says there's an invisible divide between them, a barrier and a forbidden partition.
And the description is crystal clear. One is fresh and sweet, good to drink. The other is salty and bitter. So, what on earth is this barrier it's talking about?
Well, the author points to the specific Arabic word used here, barzakh. It doesn't mean a physical wall, like a dam. It means a separating zone, a partition, with its own distinct properties. And this, the author argues, is a perfect description of a known oceanographic phenomenon. Where a freshwater river flows into a saltwater sea, the differences in density and temperature create a dynamic zone, an estuary, that prevents the two from mixing right away.
All right, so all of this brings us to the author's final verdict. The point isn't about any one of these verses on its own. It's about their collective weight, how they all fit together, and the bigger picture they create. The author points out that water is mentioned in the Qur'an over 60 times, and they argue that each time it appears, it adds another layer, another dimension, without ever contradicting what was said before. And this is really the heart of the author's cumulative case. Water isn't just a side topic about science. It's described as a main artery that flows through and connects every major theme in the text, from the creation of a person, to the stories of Noah and Moses, to spiritual metaphors for the soul, and even descriptions of the afterlife.
So, to wrap up the author's synthesis, all these different verses aren't just scattered facts, they form a complete mosaic. And it's this perfect harmony, this way of weaving together the material world of science and the spiritual world of faith, that makes the whole "it's all just a coincidence" explanation feel, in the author's view, pretty frail.
And so the author doesn't give you the final answer. Instead, they present this whole interconnected system, biological, ecological, theological, as a kind of symphony of water. And they leave the reader, and all of us at the end of this explainer, with one last big question to think about. What or who is the source of this symphony?
All right, today we're diving into a really fascinating argument from the book 1001 Coincidences. We're looking at its fourth chapter, which examines how the human embryo is described in the Qur'an and poses a pretty provocative question. So here's the central challenge the book lays out for us. For basically all of human history, the womb was a total black box, a complete mystery. So the question is, how could a text from the 7th century describe the stages of an embryo with a kind of precision that, the source claims, science would only get to see with microscopes 1,400 years later? That's the core question we're going to explore. Okay, to really get what the book is arguing, we have to kind of step into a time machine. The source reminds us that for centuries, for millennia even, human conception was just shrouded in all sorts of myths and, plain old guesswork. Nobody could actually see what was happening in there. And this slide really sets the stage. On one hand, you had all these wild theories floating around, things the Greek philosophers were kicking around, like an embryo is just coagulated blood, or that there's a tiny, preformed human inside the male seed. But the book argues that the Qur'an's approach was completely different. It claims it didn't guess, it didn't theorize, it came in to deliver a decisive, final statement from what the book calls an all-knowing expert. So this right here is the core piece of evidence the book puts on the table. These are the verses that lay out a very specific sequence of creation. This sequence is basically the roadmap for the entire argument, so let's break it down step by step. And the book makes a really key point here. It says, look, we're not just reading this as beautiful poetry. Instead, it's analyzing these verses like a precise scientific timeline. The argument really hones in on the specific Arabic words used for each stage of our development. So the whole journey starts with this word nutfa, which means a small drop of fluid. But the book also points to the description of the womb as a secure lodging. And it argues the original Arabic implies more than just physical safety. It suggests a place of real stability and tranquility. Okay, now we get to a word that is absolutely central to the whole argument, alaqa. The author of the book actually calls this word a linguistic and scientific marvel because of its multiple meanings, which the book claims all perfectly apply to the embryo at this specific stage. So, get this. The book argues that this single Arabic word, alaka, packs in 3 totally distinct meanings. First off, it means something that clings, which the book connects to the embryo implanting itself in the uterine wall. Second, it can mean a leech, pointing to both the embryo's shape and how it draws nourishment from the mother's blood. And finally, it can also mean a clot of congealed blood, which is said to describe its external look before circulation really gets going. Following that, we have the mudga stage, which literally translates to a chewed morsel or a small piece of flesh. The source connects this description to the formation of what are called somites. These are the very beginnings of our vertebrae, and they appear along the embryo's back, giving it an appearance that the book says is remarkably similar to something that has teeth marks in it. But wait, there's another layer to this. A different verse adds to the description of the muraha, calling it partly formed and partly unformed. The source argues this is a dead-on description of cellular differentiation, that incredible process where some cells have already specialized to form tissues and organs, while other cells are still unformed and waiting for their instructions. Now, this next part is all about the sequence, the order of events. The verse describes a very specific order. First, the bones are formed, and then they are clothed with flesh, with muscle. The book asserts that this is 100% in line with modern embryology, where the cartilage model of the skeleton forms before muscles develop and wrap around it. The sequence, it claims, is perfect. So, once all the physical parts are assembled, the verse talks about this incredible final leap, becoming another creation. The source interprets this as a qualitative shift, the moment the spirit enters, transforming a biological organism into a conscious human being. It's the move from silent matter to, well, to life. And you might think the argument ends there, with that main sequence, but it actually doesn't. The book brings in other verses as corroborating evidence, focusing on these subtle details that it finds just as remarkable. Take this verse, for example, which talks about being created from a nutfatin amshaj, or what's translated as a mingled drop. And according to the source, that one word, amshaj, is a huge deal. It literally means a mixture. The argument is that this single word established the principle of biological partnership, that a human comes from a mix of fluids from both the male and the female. This was a direct contradiction to ancient theories where the woman was seen as just a passive incubator. The book also kind of zooms out to show us the bigger picture, framing this entire process as a bridge. On one end, creation begins with an extract of clay, connecting our physical bodies to the very elements of the earth. And on the other end, it concludes with becoming another creation, the infusion of spirit. So the whole story of our creation is presented as this incredible link between the material and the spiritual. The source even points to phrases that seem poetic at first, like weakness upon weakness, and argues it's actually a medically precise description of pregnancy, capturing both the immense physical toll on the mother and the utter fragility of the growing embryo. Okay, now the book presents something it calls a mathematical sign, and it's pretty interesting. Here's the first piece of the puzzle, a verse that says the total time for gestation, pregnancy, and weaning adds up to 30 months. And the second clue comes from a totally different chapter, which specifies that the period of weaning alone is 2 years, or 24 months. So you see where this is going, right? The book just sets up this super simple equation. If the total time is 30 months, and you subtract the 24 months for weaning, what are you left with for the minimum period of gestation? And the answer is 6. The book argues this is an incredibly precise medical detail embedded across 2 different chapters. 6 lunar months is the minimum period of gestation for a fetus to be able to survive outside the womb, a threshold that, as you might know, modern medicine calls the limit of viability. All right, so here's the crucial takeaway from the book's perspective. The argument isn't about any one of these details in isolation. It's about the cumulative effect of all of them together. It's about assembling all these pieces to form what it calls an intellectual mosaic. So let's recap the core pillars of the argument it's making. First, it claims these descriptions pop up consistently, over and over again. Then, the terminology used isn't just vague, it's precise and multi-layered. Third, the account is completely free from the scientific myths and errors of its time. Plus, it contains these details, like the mingled drop and the viability limit, that seem way ahead of their time. And finally, the book's ultimate claim is that the language itself is a miracle. That's the case for a divine origin, as presented in the source. And the whole argument, the whole chapter in the source material, ends with this final verse. The ultimate takeaway it wants to leave us with is that the story of our own creation, from a single drop of fluid in darkness to a thinking, feeling human being, is meant to be the most personal, the most intimate proof of a creator. A story, it says, that we literally carry inside our own bodies.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the biggest mysteries out there, the self. You know, that complex, kind of chaotic, but totally fascinating world inside each of us as mapped out by the Qur'an. And it really all kicks off with a question that, let's be honest, we've all asked ourselves at some point.
I mean, this is the fundamental question, right? Philosophers, scientists, mystics, they've all been wrestling with this for ages. Who is that I inside you? You know, the one that feels and wants things and makes choices and just experiences life? Who is that person sitting right behind your eyes? So, the source material we're looking at today doesn't just give us a simple body and soul kind of deal. Nope. It lays out a much more intricate model, a kind of wondrous trinity that makes up a human being.
Okay, so check this out. This framework basically sets up our entire existence as this dynamic tug of war. On one side, you've got the body. Think of it as having the gravity of clay, always pulling us down towards earthly things, our basic instincts. But on the other side, you have the spirit, which is described as a divine breath. This is what pulls us up. It's the source of our reason, our sense of honor, our search for something more. And where are we in all this? We, the self, the conscious I, we're right in the middle. We're the arena where this constant battle between these two forces plays out.
And here's the really crucial part. This self, this I, isn't some fixed thing. It's not static. It's on a journey. And the Qur'an actually maps out this journey, this transformation, through three really distinct developmental stages.
So these three states, they're like a ladder, a path of ascent. You start at the bottom with the most primal, instinct-driven version of yourself. Then you move up to a stage of moral awakening. And the goal, the final destination, is this state of just profound inner peace. So let's start at the beginning, at the lowest station, the imperious soul.
Okay, first up, the imperious soul. This is the self at its most basic, its most raw and untamed. It's the part of us that has totally given in to that gravity of its clay we talked about. This is the voice that's always pushing for what feels good right now. Instant gratification, selfishness, greed, with absolutely zero thought about the consequences or any higher principles.
And this verse from the Quran just nails it. The Arabic word used here, amara, is super intensive. It doesn't just mean a self that commands evil. It's a self that is relentless. It's ever insistent, constantly nagging you. But, and this is so important, look at that escape clause at the end. Except for what my Lord has given mercy. This tells you it's not a life sentence. It's a state you can absolutely overcome.
But like I said, that primal state is not where the story has to end. The journey upward begins right here, with the self-reproaching soul. And this is basically the dawn of your moral consciousness. This is the version of you that messes up, sure, but, and this is the key, it feels the sting of that mistake. It's that inner voice that pipes up and says, you know what? That wasn't right. Your conscience is officially activated.
And the source highlights something really powerful here. God actually swears an oath by the soul. Now, think about that. To swear by something is to give it immense honor. So this feeling, the state of guilt and self-blame, it's not framed as a weakness at all. It's a vital sign. It shows you're spiritually alive. It's the pain you feel right before the birth of a better self, and because of that, it's honored.
And that journey leads us to the final destination, the serene soul. Now, this isn't just about feeling calm because you got something you wanted, or that kind of empty peace that comes from not caring about anything. No, this is a deep, stable, unshakable tranquility. It's a peace that's born from certainty and from living in total harmony with your higher purpose. The inner civil war is finally over.
And just listen to the magnificent call that's made to this soul. It's reached a place where it is both well pleased with God and its own journey, and at the same time, it is pleasing back to Him. It has found its ultimate home, its ultimate sanctuary.
Okay, so that's the path. But how do you actually walk it? What's the engine that drives this whole transformation?
Well, according to our source, it all boils down to one fundamental idea: your free will and your personal responsibility. I love this analogy. It's so powerful. You are the captain of your ship. Yourself isn't just some passive victim of your genes or your environment or your instincts. No way. The self is the captain, standing at the helm, and it is 100% responsible for steering the course. You are in command.
And the Qur'an lays out the two fundamental choices that every captain has. On one path, you have purification. That means actively working to cleanse, to nurture, and to elevate yourself. And on the other path, you have corruption, which is to basically bury yourself in the mud of its lower desires to cover up its own innate light. The choice, and therefore the outcome, is entirely up to you.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. That sounds like a lot of pressure. But here's the thing. The source material gives us a very balanced, very realistic view of who we are. It doesn't ignore our deep flaws, but it also doesn't forget our inherent nobility.
I mean, the source gives us this incredibly honest self-portrait. It doesn't try to sugarcoat our earthen side at all. It describes us with this almost brutal accuracy, anxious, impatient, ungrateful, quick to despair. It just lays out the human condition, warts and all.
But then, in the very next breath, it completely counters all that weakness with this powerful declaration. This honor isn't something we earn. It's a gift. It's baked into our very being. So yeah, we're weak, but we are also honored. We're made from clay, but we carry a divine breath. And holding those two truths together, that's what saves us from both crippling despair and baseless arrogance.
So, for these flawed but honored captains, how are we supposed to navigate? Well, the final piece of this whole puzzle is an incredible tool that we all have built in, an inner moral compass. The source offers this really profound insight. The Arabic word it uses here, basira, it means more than just a witness. It's like a conclusive proof, an irrefutable testimony. The idea is that deep down, you are the evidence against yourself. It doesn't matter how many excuses you cook up for others or even for yourself. There's a part of you that knows the truth. And this is basically a call to be radically, unflinchingly honest with yourself.
So when you put it all together, the journey of the self is really the story of your life. You're the captain, steering your ship between the pull of the earth below and the call of the heavens above. And you have this inner compass, this inner witness that never lies. The only real question that's left is the captain listening to the stars?
What if the most powerful argument for a text's divine origin wasn't in its words, but in its very bones, its structure? Today, we're diving into a fascinating argument from the book 1001 Coincidences. It claims the Qur'an isn't built like a normal book at all, but more like a vast cosmic tapestry. Let's explore what that really means. Think about how we usually read and learn. We go from one idea to the next, piece by piece, like we're hopping between islands in an archipelago. And that's pretty much how all human works are built. But the argument here is that the Qur'an is based on a totally different model. It's not a chain of separate islands, but one enormous, sprawling tapestry where every single thread is already connected to all the others right from the start. All right, so first things first, let's really dig into this core idea, the fundamental difference between the logic of isolated islands and the logic of a fully integrated tapestry. So you might be asking, how could a text like this even exist? Well, the book introduces a concept it calls the universal mind. See, our human minds are analytical. To understand something, we have to break it down into smaller pieces. But just imagine a consciousness that sees everything all at once, holistically. A mind that doesn't need to build bridges between ideas, because for it, the entire interconnected web is already there. The argument is that the Quran structure is a direct reflection of that kind of mind. Now, I know, this all sounds pretty abstract, right? So to make it concrete, the book gives us 3 powerful examples. It calls them symphonies, to show us exactly how these threads are woven together in the text in a really beautiful way. So this first symphony brings together 3 things you might not immediately connect so deeply: the sky, water, and life itself. The point is that in the Quran, these aren't just separate facts of nature. They actually form a single repeating story with a deep purpose. And the cycle it describes is way more than just meteorology. It kicks off with a divine act from the sky, sending down rain. That water is then intentionally guided to barren, dead land as a clear sign of mercy. And then, from that lifeless earth, life just bursts forth. It's a complete narrative of power, mercy, and purpose, not just a science lesson on rain. And this is where the tapestry really shows its weave. The text doesn't just stop at describing the cycle of new growth. It connects it all by saying, such is the coming forth. And just like that, a lesson about agriculture becomes a direct, powerful analogy for the resurrection. The physical world is laid out as proof for the metaphysical. It's all connected. All right, for the second symphony, the focus is on a single, powerful element, a drop of water. The book tracks how this one thing is used as a consistent symbol across the entire arc of our existence, from our very origin all the way to our final destiny. You have to notice the logical consistency here. First, the text sets up this universal rule. We made from water every living thing. Okay, got it. Then it applies that same rule to our specific human origin. He was created from a gushing fluid. And finally, it uses that exact same principle as the blueprint for our future. Just like rain brings dead land back to life, thus will we bring forth the dead. It's the same logic, the same element, water, used as a single proof across all three stages of existence. So, when you look at it this way, a simple drop of rain is no longer just H2O, is it? It's totally transformed. It becomes this constant message, a reminder of where we came from, a drop of fluid, and a confirmation of where we're going, resurrection. A basic chemical element gets encoded with this profound spiritual blueprint. For the final symphony, we turn the lens inward and look at the human journey itself. The argument here is that the Qur'an presents the self, life, and death not as separate, disconnected stages, but as one single, seamless, and totally inseparable story. In this narrative, the whole journey is perfectly integrated. The self isn't some random biological accident, it's consciously created. Life isn't just a chaotic, aimless experience, it's the specific arena designed for us to use our free will and be held responsible. And death? It's not the end. It's described as a receding, a conscious, deliberate return to the one who made the self in the first place. The point is, you can't understand one stage without the other two. They're all part of the same thread. So now that we've seen these incredibly interwoven examples, we get to the core of the author's claim that this kind of structure, this dense, multi-layered, perfectly integrated weave, is fundamentally beyond what any human author could ever create. And this leads to a really bold question. I mean, think about the greatest human minds we know of, a Plato, a Tolstoy. Their genius is off the charts, but their work still moves step by step, island by island. Could even they have produced a text that operates like this seamless, networked tapestry? When you break it down, the difference is in the fundamental approach. Human genius, for the most part, works on a linear path. It analyzes things, it dissects them, it moves sequentially from A to B to C. But the structure being described here works in a totally different way, through synthesis and integration. It's really the difference between building a straight road and weaving a multidimensional web where everything connects to everything else. Just try to imagine a human author attempting to replicate this, trying to weave, say, astrophysics with embryology, ancient history with legal ethics, all at the same time and in the same breath. The author argues that the seams would inevitably start to show, right? You'd find huge gaps in knowledge, glaring contradictions, really forced and artificial connections, and you'd need these long, clunky paragraphs just to try and link two unrelated topics. So, if this structure is truly beyond human capability, what does that leave us with? Well, the conclusion the book presents is that the weave itself is the designer's signature. It's the fingerprint left on the creation. The idea here is something we could call holistic encryption. Think of it like this. The real message, the real miracle, isn't just in the content, the individual verses. It's in the architecture that holds the whole thing together. The message and the structure are completely inseparable. And this, right here, is the heart of the entire argument. It's not about trying to find one single miraculous scientific fact or some future prophecy. It's about looking at the entire building, the whole edifice. The claim is that the way the structure is built, the way every single part seamlessly connects to and supports every other part, is the proof. And all of this builds to the argument's climax, which completely reinterprets one of the most famous verses in the entire Qur'an, the challenge it lays down to its audience. Now, this is the famous challenge to produce its like. For centuries, many people have understood this as a challenge of literary beauty or eloquence. But when you look at it through the lens of this whole structural argument, the book proposes a radical new take on what its like actually means. And here's the powerful reframing. The challenge isn't to imitate the Qur'an's voice, it's to imitate its mind. The test isn't to write something that sounds as beautiful or poetic. The real challenge is to construct something with the same cognitive architecture, the same perfectly interwoven, holistic, all-encompassing network. To weave the tapestry, you'd have to be the weaver. And that leaves us with one final, fascinating question to ponder. If we really entertain this idea that the structure itself is the message, then what exactly is that message? What does a perfectly interconnected text tell us about the nature of a reality where just maybe everything really is connected? Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, you could say, provocative argument. The idea is that a single book, the Qur'an, had an impact on history so unique that it just doesn't fit the normal patterns. The source we're looking at even calls it a civilizational anomaly. So let's unpack the evidence behind this very bold claim. You know, the entire argument really boils down to this one huge question. Is it even possible for one single text to completely reshape the course of human civilization? Well, the source material we're exploring today says the answer is a big yes. And it builds its case starting with a really powerful distinction. So to get us started, the author uses this incredible analogy. Think about all of humanity's greatest works, the philosophies, the art, the scientific breakthroughs, and picture them as these mighty rivers. They absolutely carve landscapes and define their eras, for sure. But they all have a source and they all have an end. Their influence peaks and then eventually it fades. In contrast, the argument here is that the Qur'an is something else entirely. It's presented as a shoreless ocean, timeless, always present, and constantly renewing itself. This core idea, the river versus the ocean, is really the foundation for the entire argument we're about to explore. Okay, so if you're going to talk about an influence this massive, where does it even begin? Well, the argument is that it doesn't start with empires or big societal movements. No. It starts with something way more intimate, a deep personal connection that happens inside the individual soul. This personal effect is given a name, the inner tremor. And it's not just about appreciating beautiful poetry or prose. It's described as this profound spiritual jolt, this feeling that the words on the page somehow know you personally, like they understand secrets you've never even said out loud. And this slide really breaks down what that means. The text is said to connect on this almost shockingly personal level. It describes your hidden fears, it plants a little seed of hope when you're in despair, it puts a finger right on your secret wounds. The whole point is that this intimate connection is the initial spark. It's what awakens what the source calls slumbering consciences, and that's what sets the stage for everything else. Now, to show that this experience isn't just for, native Arabic speakers, the source points to people like the French historian Lamartine. His account of a prodigious effect on the soul is used to make a really key point, that this inner tremor seems to cut across language and culture, tapping into something universally human. So, the big question is, how does a collection of these personal tremors turn into a full-blown civilizational tsunami? Well, the next part of the argument zooms out. It moves from the individual soul to the sands of history itself, and it looks at a radical, society-wide transformation. The argument here really leans on this stark before and after picture of history. On one side, you have the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula, which is painted as this chaotic landscape of warring tribes caught in endless cycles of vengeance. And then, on the other side, you have a united community with a clear purpose, transformed from a fringe society into the leaders of a global civilization. And here's the kicker. The speed. This wasn't some slow, centuries-long evolution. It's described as a chemical transformation, a complete and total restructuring of a society in less than a single generation. That speed, the argument goes, just completely defies the normal rules of how we think history and social change work. Okay, so we've looked at the impact on individuals and on a whole society. Now, the argument brings in some outside witnesses, so to speak. The next bits of evidence come from some of history's most famous non-Muslim thinkers, who are presented here as impartial observers of the text's power. And first up is a real giant of world literature, the German literary master Goethe. While he was exploring Eastern ideas, he made this incredibly powerful statement. And the source makes it clear this isn't seen as a religious conversion. It's framed as this profound intellectual and spiritual admission, a confession that the core message he was finding in the Qur'an just hit him with a sense of universal truth. Next up, we have a giant of the novel, someone famous for his own deep spiritual quest. Leo Tolstoy, the Russian novelist. I mean, this is a man who spent his entire life searching for moral truth. And the source points out that he didn't just admire the Quran, he actually recommended it. He saw it as a pure source of wisdom for anyone who wanted to achieve true greatness. For the author, getting that kind of endorsement from a deep moral thinker like Tolstoy says a lot about the text's spiritual weight. And the final witness in this group is basically the father of modern Russian literature. Now, this is really interesting. What Alexander Pushkin did was different. He didn't just write a critique or an essay about the Quran. He was so moved by it that he created new art from it, weaving its themes directly into his own poetic masterpiece. And this act of creation, it's held up as proof that the Quran could not only convince the mind, but actively inspire the creative soul, even across huge cultural gaps. So, what's the secret to its staying power? How has it remained so central for over 1,400 years? Well, the final piece of this argument suggests that the text actually has its own built-in mechanism for staying relevant, an engine that keeps it from ever becoming dated. You see, the source argues that far from asking for blind faith, the Quran is constantly pushing its readers to think, to reason, and to reflect. This verse is presented as a direct command that's baked right into the text: engage your intellect. And this chart breaks down that process perfectly. First, the text asks a question. It throws out a challenge. Then, the reader engages with it using all the knowledge of their time. And through that very engagement, new layers of meaning are uncovered. This cycle, this engine of renewal, is what supposedly allows every new generation to find fresh relevance in the text, making sure it stays a living document, not just a historical artifact. All right, so now we get to the end, where the author takes these 4 different impacts, the personal one, the societal one, the testimony of outsiders, and its enduring nature, and weaves them all together into one big final conclusion. The final thesis isn't just about any one of these things by itself, it's about what's called their impossible convergence. The argument is that finding this level of literary beauty, deep psychological insight, social legislation, and world-changing power all packed together into a single text, well, that's the real anomaly. And this all leads to the ultimate conclusion, which is captured by the Quranic phrase, a weighty word. The weight here comes from the combined gravity of all those impacts we just talked about, the spiritual, the societal, the intellectual, and the historical. The core argument of the source is that this cumulative weight, this weighty word, is just too heavy to be explained away as the work of human genius alone. And so we're left with this final, really thought-provoking question. When you consider all these points, that inner tremor, the massive civilizational shift, the testimony from outsiders, and this built-in engine for renewal, is it all just a series of 1,000 coincidences, or is each one a distinct impact pointing towards something else entirely? That's the question the source leaves us to think about.
Welcome to our explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating argument from the book, 1,001 Coincidences. The core idea is that the Quran shouldn't be seen as just a collection of separate wonders, but as one single, interconnected, holistic miracle. Now, that's a pretty big claim, right? So let's dive in and see exactly how the author builds that case.
So it all really boils down to this one central question. Are the incredibly complex, beautiful patterns inside the Quran just a series of random, even if they're remarkable, coincidences? Or are they proof of something else entirely? That's the choice the author basically puts in front of you.
Okay, so to really get where the author is coming from, we have to start with the biggest, most obvious counterargument. Coincidence, right? It's often the simplest explanation for any kind of unusual pattern, and it's the very idea that the author sets out to systematically take apart. And the author has this fantastic analogy to frame the whole investigation. We're not just reading a book on the surface. We're told to think of ourselves as divers plunging into an ocean. The argument is that the deeper you go, the more those simple, surface-level explanations, like, oh, it's just a coincidence, well, they start to crumble under the immense pressure of the evidence you find.
And this is what the author calls the coincidence hypothesis.
It's that easy assumption that any single amazing scientific insight or profound bit of wisdom in an ancient text is, well, it's just a lucky guess. A stroke of genius, maybe. And look, if you take just one of those things by itself, sure, that might make sense. But the author's entire argument is built on this key idea, that logic completely falls apart when you stop looking at these marvels one by one.
So, how do you even begin to argue against that? Well, the author proposes this core principle, one that's designed to show how, as the evidence starts to pile up, the possibility of it all being just a coincidence, well, it simply vanishes.
It's called the law of the vanishing of coincidence. And you can think of it like this. If you find one four-leaf clover, that's a cool coincidence. But if you find 100 of them in the same 1 square foot patch of grass, well, it's not a coincidence anymore. You'd start to think something's going on, right? There's a reason. The author applies that same logic here, arguing that with every new piece of evidence, every scientific harmony, every interconnected theme, the probability of it all being random chance just drops and drops until it becomes practically zero.
And to make this idea absolutely unforgettable, the author gives us this incredible analogy. They say that dismissing the Qur'an's intricate, ordered structure as just coincidence is like claiming that a beautiful, majestic palace, with all its rooms and arches, was built by a random earthquake.
I mean, the point is pretty clear, right? You don't get a masterpiece of architecture from random chaos.
So, if coincidence isn't the answer, then what is? The author builds this incredible case on what they call 6 fundamental pillars of proof, and each one is designed to support that final, staggering conclusion.
All right, so here's the roadmap the author lays out for us. First, you've got the law of vanishing coincidence, which we've just talked about. Second is the unity of themes that run through the whole text. Third, the scientific concordances. These are facts the author says were unknown at the time. Fourth is the complete absence of regional myths, which really sets it apart from other texts of its era. Fifth is this deeply interconnected network of meaning within the text itself. And finally, number 6, its unparalleled impact on civilization. Let's zoom in on a couple of these.
Let's take that fourth pillar, the idea that it's myth-free. You have to picture the world back then. The author says it was just swimming in regional folklore, superstitions, and contradictory stories. But the Quran, they argue, stands in total contrast. It presents this coherent, unified vision that is completely free of the local legends that were so common in that time and place.
And then you have pillar number 3, the scientific concordances. Now, the claim here is really specific. We're not talking about vague, poetic hints that could mean anything. The argument is that the text contains these precise descriptions of things like the water cycle, the developmental stages of an embryo, and even the layers of the atmosphere. Details that, according to the author, science would only figure out centuries down the line.
Okay, and this is really where it all clicks into place. The author's point isn't that any single one of these pillars is the smoking gun. Not at all. It's about their convergence. It's about how they all lock together to form what the author calls a holistic miracle.
So what on earth does holistic phenomenon mean? Well, think about a living person. A person is made of cells, tissues, organs, but you can't just look at the liver or the brain or the heart in a petri dish and say, I understand this human being. The life, the consciousness, the person, that's something so much greater than the sum of their parts. That's the argument here, that the Quran acts as a single, integrated whole, not just a grab bag of impressive verses. So let's break down what that convergence actually looks like. The author's point is, look, you might find a book of incredible poetry, or you might find a separate book with surprising scientific precision. But to find all of these qualities, the poetic beauty, the scientific accuracy, the deep philosophy, the legislative wisdom, and that powerful emotional impact all together in one single organically unified text is, in their view, something completely unheard of. And this next quote, honestly, it's the core thesis of the whole final chapter. The claim isn't just that there are individual miracles sprinkled throughout the text. The ultimate argument is that the greatest miracle of all is how all of these different dimensions, poetry, science, law, come together into one single harmonious structure. So, all of this convergence, it leads the author to a final and pretty staggering conclusion about the very nature and origin of the text. They present it as an accomplishment that is just beyond what humans are capable of. Basically, the author's final conclusion is this: the way all these elements are woven together makes the Quran logically impossible for any human to replicate. The argument isn't just that it would be really, really hard. It's that no single human mind, or even a whole committee of the greatest minds, could simultaneously master poetry, science, law, and philosophy, and then weave them all into a single flawless, unified whole. Its very structure, they claim, makes it inimitable.
And the author wraps up the entire argument by presenting this verse from the Qur'an itself. In their view, this isn't just presented as a statement of faith, it's offered up as the direct, logical endpoint of this entire evidence-based argument that they've been building, the final word on the matter.
And so, all of this leaves us with a really big question to think about. The author charts this journey from what they call the specter of coincidence to the ocean of certainty. And it really challenges us to think about evidence itself, and to ask ourselves, at what point does a mountain of interlocking data stop being just a series of coincidences and become something else entirely?